Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to begin. From the Arcadian Court in downtown Toronto, welcome to the 112th season of the Empire Club of Canada. For those of you just joining us through either our webcast or our podcast, welcome to the meeting. And we're very pleased to have a very distinguished speaker with us today. But before we get to him, let me introduce you to our head table. I'd ask each guest, please, to rise for a brief moment and then be seated as your name is called. And I'd ask that the audience refrain from applauding until all of the head table guests have been introduced. So, in no particular order, Monsieur Marc-André Blanchard, Chair and Chief Executive Officer, McCarthy Tétrault. Mr. Paul Foglin, Director, Government and Stakeholder Relations, Ontario Retirement Communities Association, and a Director of the Empire Club of Canada. Mr. Ian Black, the General Manager of Uber Canada. Mr. Karim Hirji, Senior Vice President, International Ventures, Intact Financial. Mr. Matthew Kelleher, Partner, McCarthy Tétrault. Mr. Andrew McDonald, Regional Chair Manager, Uber Central. Mr. Tim Smitherman, Manager, Government and Public Relations, Samsung Renewable Energy, Inc., and a Director of the Empire Club of Canada. And Mr. David Plouffe, Chief Advisor, Uber, and former Senior Advisor and Campaign Manager to President Barack Obama. I'd like to acknowledge the presence in our live audience today of special guests MPP Tim Hudak. Tim, where are you? Welcome. MPP Michael Harris. Welcome, Michael. And past President Noble Chamar. Noble, nice to have you with us. Ladies and gentlemen, there are so many subjects that our guest today would have been comfortable speaking on, which is perhaps why he is invited regularly to contribute to some of the world's largest media outlets, such as ABC News and Bloomberg Television. His extensive knowledge on a wide range of issues is no doubt a key factor behind Newsweek naming him one of the new thought leaders of America in 2010, and the Daily Beast singling him out during that same period as one of the 25 smartest people of the decade. In 2012, GQ magazine named him the third most powerful person in Washington, putting him in the holy trinity of political influence, which most government relations professionals can only dream of. Mr. Plouffe is widely referred to as the architect of President Barack Obama's two presidential campaign victories, and after the 2008 campaign, served inside the White House as senior advisor to the president. Many of the people in our audience today and those watching us at home will have read his New York Times bestseller, The Audacity to Win, the inside story and lessons of Barack Obama's historic victory. So, as you can well imagine, especially during this hotly contested election period here in Canada, Mr. Plouffe could well have chosen to address us today on a political issue relating to government and how it gets itself elected in the modern age. But as we've stated, Mr. Plouffe is a man of many interests and talents, and as such, decided to join almost exactly 1 year ago one of the most unusual new companies of our era, one that has started an international conversation around a whole raft of issues. Uber has, in fact, become one of the largest transportation companies on the planet, and yet they hardly own any assets at all. Could that be the future? And if that's the future in the private sector, what will the impact be on the business of government? Are we moving toward a whole new concept of business without any brick and mortar? These are no doubt questions that Mr. Plouffe thinks a great deal about, and why we've invited him here today to deal with one of the most important issues of the future of developed economies such as the one we live in. What is the future of transportation, and how will that impact our daily lives? So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome to Canada the Chief Advisor to Uber and to its CEO, Travis Kalanick, Mr. David Plouffe.
Well, thank you, Gordon, for that introduction and your leadership of the Empire Club, and thanks all of you for being here. You're generous with your time. You might have showed up because you thought I would reassure you that we will not be electing Donald Trump president. I can reassure you of that, but maybe we'll talk about politics later. I want to thank McCarthy for hosting me and sponsoring this event. And I'm so privileged to be here and spend a little time talking about Uber. And I'm curious, before I start, how many of you have used Uber or a service like it? If you wouldn't mind raising your hand. Okay, well, first of all, thank you. And I will skip the remedial explanation of what we do. But I would like to take this opportunity maybe to elevate the debate a little bit. I think that a lot of the debate about Uber, and it's a new technology. Some call it disruptive. Some say it's reforming transportation. And oftentimes it's viewed through the prism of old versus new and Uber versus taxi and, how should we operate? Should we operate? And we're involved in some very important discussions here in Toronto. The city staff has put forward some modern ride-sharing regulation frameworks that will be voted on the City Council next Wednesday. And so any of you have influence there, we'd ask you to lift your voices, your prominent voices, to make it clear that modern ride-sharing regulations have a place here in Toronto and Canada. But this is about, bigger issues than just, I think, often how it's covered. This is really about, first of all, helping the economy. I think oftentimes, and it's natural when we first come into a market, there's early adopters and people view Uber as something that, younger hipster types are taking to bars, and there's a few drivers helping them do that. And by the way, that's an important use case. We're seeing all over the globe reduction in driving while drinking. In fact, there's a behavioral change going on based on our research with people under 25. If they live in an urban area where ride sharing is available, they don't even think about driving drunk. Why would you if you can just press a button? And so that's a huge use case. But what happens is there's a huge unaddressed market. So the for-hire vehicle market, which is traditionally thought to be taxi and limousine in most cities, we view here in Toronto it probably grows 5 times over the next 4 or 5 years. So what's clear is there's a lot of people that were looking for a different way to get around their city, and there's a lot of people who would like to make a little money helping them do it. And so this is a false debate between Uber and taxi or Uber and public transportation. We become part of an ecosystem. We don't do street hails. Our big proposition is not necessarily in financial districts or outside of 5-star hotels. We serve underserved areas all throughout the GTA here, all throughout the world. And, here in Toronto alone, we have 16,000 people as of today driving on the Uber platform. All different kinds of people. Some of them are driving 40 hours a week, and that's their main source of income. Most aren't. Half of our drivers here in Toronto drive less than 10 hours a week. It's not even really a part-time job. It's something people are doing around the rest of their lives to make a little bit of income. This is something I'm passionate about. The reason I joined Uber, many reasons. One is to be surrounded by people who are younger and smarter than myself. I find that's always a good thing to do through life. But you will not find too many people, I have found, who can answer on scale the question of, that's bedeviling countries all around the world. Even as the economy recovers in most places and the unemployment rate recedes in most places, how do we actually grow incomes in an appreciable way, on scale? A lot of policy solutions, and we should try all of them. But what's happening with platforms like Uber is people are making, as a family, let's say $40,000 or $42,000 in their core enterprises, and one of them drives 10 or 12 hours a week, and they go from 42 to 60. To them, that's a small miracle, particularly when you do it on your terms. When you're not told when to drive, there's no schedule. You have your job and your school and your kids and your aging parents and your social obligations, and then you decide, here's when I'm going to use Uber. So that's what this is about from an economic standpoint. And we're at 16,000 drivers today on the platform. And if you think about if the for-hire vehicle market grows as we think it could, you're going to see a lot more. In some of our more mature cities, Los Angeles, we have 42,000 drivers today on the Uber platform. Chicago, over 30. And even in smaller communities, whether that's London or Hamilton, you have a few hundred people driving. And even though those cities aren't large global cities like Toronto, in cities like that, there's fewer transportation options. There's fewer cabs, and there's very little public transportation, at least on scale. So I think the economic picture here, and all of you obviously have built and grow successful businesses, and you care about the future of this city. So when you talk about that many people who've improved their lives in that way, it's a significant, significant addition. And of course, economically, all the people in the back of the car are going somewhere. Some of them are just going home, but many of them are going to small businesses. It used to be you had to cite a restaurant or retail establishment based on a public transportation line. That doesn't have to happen anymore. People are delivered to your doorstep. People are more likely to come in from the suburbs to cities when they don't have to worry about parking, the expense of that. Worried about is, if I go out of the restaurant at 10:30, will there be a cab there? They know they can press a button while they're paying their check, and the car will be there. Extension of public transportation, something we're very excited about. In a couple of U.S. cities, in Atlanta and Dallas, Texas, we're in the app for the public transportation agency. So someone who's on that subway or train asks for a car before they get to the last stop, and they know it's going to be there. So the economic scale of this, I think, is bigger than sometimes people imagine. And honestly, it's not something our two founders, one of them proudly is from Canada, from Calgary, this isn't what they had in mind. They were just trying to improve transportation in San Francisco for their friends. But it's grown into something that shows there's a huge unmet need on the transportation side. But there's also a huge need for people to make more income. And this is an easy way for people to do it on their terms. In terms of the mobility challenges, every city in the world is dealing with too much congestion. Toronto's a good example of that. And a trend of urbanization, the likes of which the planet has never seen. People are coming to cities with a velocity that has never happened in the history of humankind. Millennials in particular want to be in urban areas. Well, unless you're some cities in China, maybe Dubai, there's not much more space to build public transportation. There's really not much more time or money or space to build new freeways or even to add lanes. So the math is the math. You have more people coming into already congested cities. So what are we going to do about that? We have to make sure that we reduce personal car use. Maybe that's a family with 2 cars going down to 1. Maybe it's a young person deciding never to purchase a car. I'm surprised, my generation, you turn 16, you got your license, you saved up money to buy a car. I still like to drive. The younger people today, they have less of an interest in that. They want to travel a lot and not be tied down. So it fits the way they want to live. So the core proposition of the Uber products today are that someone is not driving their own car. Cars today around the world are utilized 4% of the time, by the way. The most underutilized asset in the world is our vehicles. And there's 1.2 people per car. Think about that. Well, the average Uber car, even if someone's just driving 3 or 4 hours a day, is putting 16, 18 people into it. But where this goes from here is what we're really excited about. And again, this is not where we started, but we're learning as we go. And we have something called Uber Pool that we experimented with here during the Pan Am Games. It's in LA, San Francisco, LA, San Francisco, Paris, and New York, and a couple cities in China. And what that means is if you order an UberX today, for those of you who've done that, someone shows up in a Toyota Prius. Well, you can opt in those cities, as you could during the Pan Am Games. So if I'm going from here to the back of the room, and this gentleman in the red tie is going in the same direction roughly, we can choose to share the ride. Carpooling on scale, which the world's talked about since 1973, the first big OPEC oil shock. It's never worked on scale. Well, it's working. It's half-price transportation, which means the Uber ride, which is already less expensive than many transportation options, becomes available to just about every income spectrum. And that's important because we know, I've probably consumed more political research over the last 10 years than anyone in the world, sadly. Not how I intended to spend my life. But what you get back from people, obviously the average person, no matter where they live, is I'm struggling with money, I don't feel secure enough economically. I'm also struggling with time. Time is almost as big as pressure as money. And transportation is too expensive and takes too long for too many people. So when you can bring it to the masses, inexpensive transportation, whether they're going from home to work or home to the subway line, it's a huge deal. So half-price transportation below UberX. The drivers are making more money because they're on a perpetual trip. Someone's always in the car. But then you have the added benefit of congestion reduction, because then you really begin to bend the curve when you're doing carpooling on scale. And like most things at Uber, we experiment. We did not know if this would work. And in the beginning, it didn't work that well when we launched it in San Francisco last year. Now in San Francisco, 50% of the people who choose to use an Uber ask to carpool. Why do they do it? They do it largely because it is inexpensive. But they also do it because they feel like they're making a contribution to the environment, to the climate, to congestion. That won't work everywhere. It has to be dense urban areas with a lot of driver supply, but it will work here in Toronto, which is a major global city. And carpooling on scale is going to make transportation potentially transform the way cities move. Los Angeles is probably one of the historic cities about congestion. If 15% of the people in LA carpooled, there'd never be another traffic backup. Now, 15's a lot, but it's not so crazy. And we just announced yesterday in Chengdu, China, which is Uber's largest city now, something called Uber Commute, which means you can choose to be an Uber driver just on your commute. So you're going into work and you decide, I'm going to pick up somebody from the neighborhood, and then you're going home and you drive somebody home. So these are not even our traditional 10-hour-a-week Uber drivers. These are just people, right? So again, trying to bring technology and efficiency to something that really has bedeviled communities. How do we have less cars with one person in it driving back and forth every day, causing nightmares at rush hour? So from a mobility option, we think we can help reduce congestion, help reduce the number of cars on the road. You know, we think in the U.S. we're getting amongst Uber users, and we're still young, so lots of people haven't even heard about Uber, much less used us. But amongst Uber users, 8 or 9% of our users in the U.S. say they've given up a car. Okay? It's beginning to scale in terms of behavior change. And then we just become part of the ecosystem. So some people, and for those of you that do this, we're very grateful, choose to use this to get around your city as your primary option. But most don't. Most people may still drive themselves occasionally, or they'll take us into town and take a taxi home, or they'll use public transportation, or they'll bike. But we become part of that solution. So I think about some of the biggest problems facing the world. And listen, we're a business. We're trying to be a successful business. We have a bottom line. We're not a nonprofit. But as we get deeper into this, we see that some of the central challenges facing large cities in the world, more mobility options, less congestion, less emissions, more economic opportunity, is something that we can be, on scale, a pretty important part of the solution set. And so that's what this debate's really about, and we're hoping that the Toronto City Council can send a strong signal next week that they're going to embrace modern ride-sharing regulations. About 60 states and cities in the U.S. have passed new laws over the last year to do so. Mexico City is the biggest global city to do so. The Philippines was the first country to do so. So there's momentum there, because I think people are starting to see it's bigger than just like this Uber taxi debate. There's a lot of benefit here to cities if we approach this right. So we're excited about being a partnership here. I will add, you know, it's interesting, Beck Taxi, which is a prominent player in the taxi industry, reported that last year was their best year ever. So again, back to the market growing, the pie grows. When more people decide to get around their cities not driving their own car, public transportation will benefit, taxi will benefit, ride-sharing companies like Uber will benefit. And I do think that Toronto is a global city. I think that if Toronto moves forward here on regulations, it won't just impact the rest of this country, which is so very important, but I think it'll also send a strong global signal and help us forward here on our march. So we're excited about what we're working on here. We're experimenting with other products, as you know. I don't know if any of you have tried Uber Eats. Who's tried Uber Eats? Okay, so I highly recommend it. Now this is, it's a great product. Who knew, by the way, I didn't know, that people wanted food, sandwiches, salads on demand in 5 minutes, but it turns out they do. People want everything. I think today's offering for us is from Dundas Park Kitchen. It's a great chicken stew. But there's a lot we can do with this platform. If you've built a matrix, so to speak, if people want food in 5 minutes in their busy day, we can do that. We've experimented with other sorts of delivery of goods. So we're going to continue to innovate. I think the core innovation, though, is how do we offer a ride in 3 to 4 minutes to as many people on the planet as possible? Ideally, how do we offer that ride in a way that people are sharing the ride to bring costs and emissions down? And how do we help answer the question that every city is facing, which is how are we going to survive the population explosion that's going to happen in a situation where we are already so stressed and challenged from a mobility standpoint? So I want to thank you for your time today. And we're going to have some time, Gordon. I know he said everyone's got a hard stop. You've got to get back to your offices, so I appreciate you staying here. And we can talk more about Uber politics or whatever you'd like. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Now, while you were speaking, actually, somebody handed me 4 questions So, new segment at the Empire Club. We're going to do rapid fire round.
Rapid fire.
Okay. Number one, and you alluded to this partly, but why did you join Uber, other than young and brilliant people? But was there something else?
Well, that's part of it. I mean, I think that as you get along in life, the ability to learn new things and be challenged is important, and get out of the comfort zone a little bit. So I've been in politics and government a very long time, and where there's some similarities to what I'm doing now, I'm learning a lot every day from a lot of smart people. So that was from a sort of personal standpoint. I was also, my family and I were really desperate to get out of Washington, D.C., and we were probably going to go back to Chicago, but this was such an interesting opportunity. My wife used to live in San Francisco that it, from a personal standpoint, made a lot of sense. But I do believe in the mission. I mean, I will tell you, sitting in government meetings, particularly in the White House or when I'm talking to governors, there's a lot of good ideas about there in education and workforce development and child care credits for tax credits for child care. A lot of things we need to do, but it is sometimes discouraging that on scale, there's not enough answers to how do we get more income in more people's pockets, right? And you can say, well, ideally, someone wouldn't have to drive a car for 8 hours to go up $10,000 or $12,000. But right now, for them to do it on their own terms, it couldn't be more important to them, right? I mean, I think that the numbers are 40% of people in America say they could not sustain an unexpected bill of $1,000. Okay, that's where a lot of people are. So for people to have the ability quickly to earn some income, either in a steady way or in an episodic way, is a big thing. So I'm very, very passionate about that.
Okay, rapid fire round question number two. What do you make of the City Hall debate on September the 30th?
Well, it's an important debate. I think that the staff has put forward some solid recommendations. These would be not exactly all the details, but a framework for modern ride-sharing regulations. And that's what's required, because most transportation regulations, whether they be here in Toronto or in Germany or in most places in the U.S. or Australia, pick your country, were written a long time ago. Pre-GPS, pre-smartphone, in some cases pre-cellular technology. So that's not going to be a terribly satisfying discussion of how do we fit this new technology-based platform into old regulations. So you have to modernize. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want to be regulated. That's a misperception about us. We're in rooms every day around the world to get regulated. But modern, smart, forward-looking, economically positive regulations that have in them, as a matter of law, what kind of safety regime we need to follow, insurance, vehicle inspections, so that there's certainty for the public that this is done in a smart and safe way, but that enables this to be available both on the rider side and the driver side to as many people. So that's what's at stake. And again, I think that it's important for Toronto that this be successful, but I think the message it will send throughout the country and the world will be very significant.
Question number three. It's funny, we have the mayor of Montreal here in a few weeks. I wish he was here to hear the answer to this. Can taxis and Uber peacefully coexist?
Oh, of course. I mean, those that, first of all, there is some competition. Some of you have probably done this. You might have taken a taxi 3 years ago and now you take an Uber. But, on scale, the decision most of our customers use is perhaps not to drive their own car and order an Uber. So as that for-hire vehicle market expands, there's still going to be a healthy place for taxi. Now, they won't have a monopoly anymore. And so that's where I think a lot of the rhetoric coming from the taxi owners, less the taxi drivers, but the taxi owners, is that this is an all-or-nothing proposition. And here in Toronto, as I said, Beck said it was their best year ever last year as we were scaling. You go to Chicago, you go to Michigan Avenue, there's taxis everywhere and they have people in them. Same thing in Manhattan. New York's a great example. For those of you that have been to New York, Manhattan, the central business district, the Empire State Building, listen, it's very easy to get a yellow cab. Maybe not when it's raining and not in all parts of Manhattan, but 95% of taxi trips in New York City happen in Manhattan. But the rest of the city, the other boroughs, Staten Island, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, very underserved. And so 35% of Uber trips happen in those areas. And that's the same thing here in the GTA. I mean, our big value prop is underserved areas. Some of those are low-income areas. Sometimes they're suburban areas. Sometimes they can just be the fate of urban planning, where there's almost a transportation desert that arose because of the way public transportation was designed. So, yes, they can coexist. And in fact, as more people make the decision to reduce their own use of their own car, much less buy one, I think all sectors that are involved in moving people around cities can thrive. But it won't be a monopoly.
And the last question that I'm not sure where this one came from. It's vaguely unfair, but vitally interesting. What do you think about the Canadian federal election?
Wow. Well, I learned a long time ago not to lecture anyone on their own politics. I would say that, well, it's fascinating. I mean, we're obviously having a very fascinating election in America. Some might call it a spectacle, but it'll sort itself out. I find this fascinating simply because to have, at this point, and you've still got a few weeks, to have three parties so closely, and really in the 30-30-30 range when it's not moving much, is just a fascinating election. And where my brain goes is the data then to really understand who still at this date can move is fascinating. And I think there was a lot of attention in the Obama campaign on our use of data and technology. I think way too much. At the end of the day, if Barack Obama was not an effective candidate, none of that would have mattered at all, okay? First principles are you a compelling leader? Do you have a compelling message in the right time? Sometimes you can be both of those things, and it's just not your moment. That being said, in an election like this, really knowing as much about those people and how they make their decisions and the best way to reach them is fascinating. So I'll be watching it very carefully just to see, does it stay locked in that really, really tight margin? Or does one or two of the parties begin to open up a little bit of breathing room? I don't know. It's fascinating. I will say about politics generally, something's happening, around the world. I mean, you see Trump in America, you see Bernie Sanders in America, you see some of the extremist parties even in places like Scandinavia, Le Pen in France, the Labour election that just happened in the UK. I mean, there's a lot of dissatisfaction out there. In America, we call them landslides when one party wins a dominant victory. And they don't happen that often. The two big examples in our country were 1974 during Watergate when Richard Nixon had to resign, and in 1994 after Bill Clinton's first term, the Republicans won everything there was to win. Well, what's fascinating is that in our last 5 elections, we've had 4 landslides. 2006, 2008, big Democrat. 2010, big Republican. 2012, lean Democratic, but not as big. 2014, big Republican. So the voters could not be shouting out more loudly that, hey, guess what? Not satisfied. Some of that's because of the recession and economy, but a lot of it's because they just don't feel like they're getting the answers, the cooperation, solutions they need. So I also think what you're seeing is a little bit different here, I think, particularly with the advent of, you've got 3 major contenders, but certainly in America, and I think you see this in other parts of the world, the sort of bases of the political parties are pulling further and further apart, right? So, even in America, where I think any fair assessment of the last 7 years would be progressives have really been able to accomplish a lot of what they've wanted to accomplish for decades. You still have some saying we haven't gone far enough, and you have Republicans saying, Mitt Romney and John McCain were moderate sellouts. We need someone more conservative. So that's such an interesting dynamic. I happen to think it's a very toxic one and will make it harder for actual progress to be made because it makes it harder for somebody to reach out their hand because just the sheer act of reaching out their hand is a traitorous act. But there's a lot going on, and I do think there's the issue of income growth that we talked about in relation to our platform is real out there, right? And so people see markets coming back, even with the turbulence over the last few months, broadly, directionally positive, profits coming back. But they're feeling like they're still kind of running on a treadmill, and they're feeling a little bit more secure that they're going to have a job, but it's not necessarily one of aspiration. So I think there's a lot of things going on out there, so that was not a quick answer. But I do think that it's just fascinating to see a race. I think the French election, which is a ways off, could be also interesting like that, where you have 3 parties and candidates probably pretty close to each other. And then how does that unfold? So we'll be watching with bated breath, and I appreciate you not asking me a direct Trump question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. I'll just start back. Okay, actually, I have one question I wanted to add to that, too, because we do have the time. None of those questions were from me, by the way. Uber in 20 years, when you're older and I'm very old, what's it going to look like? Will it be, have you reached almost the market share that you think is possible, or is it going to keep going? Might it be a much bigger enterprise in 20 years?
Well, I think crystal balls these days 2 years out are almost impossible, much less 20, given the pace of change. Where will virtual reality be by the end of the decade? Some suggest we won't have televisions or computers anymore, and we'll be immersed in that world. So I don't know. I know that the core value proposition of how can we help build the cities of the future and provide more mobility option will be at the core. We are in 61 countries now and 335 cities, but think about that. There are thousands and thousands of more cities where our model will work. Thousands. And what's interesting is we find that it works in smaller communities as well, because there may be even more of a dire need there. So there's a lot more countries. Our goal really is to provide to as many people who live on this planet a ride within 3 or 4 minutes at the press of a button. And what's interesting is the model works everywhere. China obviously has huge mobility challenges and huge need for more economic growth, wage growth. It's interesting, you look at a country like Cairo. Cairo has obviously had a very tough time, and people were concerned the economy would not recover for a long time, and it's very troubled. But I think, have over 10,000 drivers now in Cairo, people who are in desperate need. Some of these are former, accountants and doctors who are looking for that. Saudi Arabia is an interesting use case. 90% of our ridership in Saudi Arabia is women because they have limited mobility options. So we're excited because while there's distinction every place, whether that's from a regulatory standpoint or from the public infrastructure or the use case, it works everywhere. So we have a lot more cities to enter. The truth is, even though we are probably in this room well known and well covered, even here in Toronto, I would hazard to guess half the people who live in the GTA do not know what Uber is. In San Francisco, we still have 20 or 25% that don't. I mean, some of our major cities, we still have 20 or 25,000 people a week downloading the app because they've never heard about it. So we have a lot of room to grow in our existing cities. We are experimenting with some other ways to use the platform. But what we're really excited about is there's just a lot more cities for us to enter. And a lot of them have more limited mobility solutions. So there may be, there's even a bigger use case in terms of what we can bring.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Thank you for being such a great sport and taking our first ever rapid fire round. That's great. Ladies and gentlemen, here to express our collective appreciation is Marc-André Blanchard.
So thank you, Gord. I'm on behalf of McCarthy Tétrault, our firm, you'll allow me one sentence about selling our firm. We've been recognized by the Financial Times as the most innovative law firm in Canada and one of the 3 most innovative in North America. So you'll understand that we're very, very proud to be sponsoring this launch. We think it's very much aligned with our innovative strategy. The future of transportation is a central issue for our communities and our businesses. And the focus on this issue right now is an imperative. I want to thank all of you for joining us and embracing change rather than fearing it, for approaching every challenge as an opportunity, and for believing that innovation drives the economy and makes Canada a leader. David, it is a privilege for me to thank you. I've been a very big fan of yours. I read your book. I then thought that not only it was a fantastic book or narrative of a successful election campaign, but I must say to all of us in the room that are business or that are into business or communities, leadership or anything like that, it's a must-read. It was a book about, obviously, crisis management, but above all, it was a book about pursuing a vision, innovation, values, strategy, brand, teamwork, leadership, resilience, and flawless execution, and obviously change. But the core of what David said today evokes the same alignment and discipline and audacity in the same way. So thanks again for sharing your insight and vision and assisting us in elevating the debate. And thank you to Uber for leading this discussion and showing us a glimpse of the future and providing some opportunities for economic growth for all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc-André. I'd also like to thank our generous sponsors, McCarthy Tétrault, for sponsoring our event today, Also like to thank the National Post, which is our print media sponsor. Ladies and gentlemen, please follow us at empire_club and visit us online at empireclub.org. And you can also follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Please join us again soon. We have a really interesting fall lined up starting next week. We're going to have the Premier of Alberta giving her first major address outside of that province on Alberta's future, October 2nd at the Hilton Hotel. We have our own Premier coming to the Empire Club the following week, October 5th, and she may actually be talking a little bit about that last question that you spoke to, David. And also a big event, December 8th, mark your calendars, we're going to have the Governor of the Bank of Canada talking about the future of Canada's economy next year. Thank you for your attendance today, ladies and gentlemen, and this meeting is now formally adjourned. Thank you.